Hey, what's up everyone? Endgame here, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about two stocks, two space-oriented businesses I will most likely be purchasing in 2023. Space has been heating up. New space race between pretty much the whole world is heating up pretty intensely. And as you guys can see, investments in Space Blast Off, total value of investments in startup space companies between 2015 and 2021 has increased almost fourfold. It went from $4 billion to almost $16 billion being invested in companies that are focusing on space exploration. As you can see, the US commercial space launches in the last 30 years have continuously picked up pace. This means we have more and more launches every single year, and this is a trend that will most likely continue. Now, before I go into these two stocks, I just want to mention that neither one of these stocks is SpaceX, because SpaceX is a private company. You cannot own shares in the company yet, but there are some proxies you can own that will give you exposure to SpaceX as a company. For example, Google holds about 5%, plus or minus few percent of the total company for SpaceX. So if you want some exposure, you can look at Google. And I'm also pretty sure some Fidelity funds as well have limited exposure, around 5 to 8% as well. First company I will most likely be buying is Lockheed Martin, LMT. As you guys can see, this company has actually fared pretty well. Their stock has not totally collapsed like most businesses have in 2022. They are only about $10 to $20 away from their all-time highs. And another really big issue here is they're actually even paying dividends. So these guys are paying around 2.5% dividend, which is pretty significant in these times where pretty much everything is just collapsing. The value is evaporating from pretty much every single company in the market. And these guys are holding strong. They have a pretty solid share price, and they have a pretty solid dividend yield. And what else can you ask during one of the worst bear markets in the previous decade? So let's see here. Lockheed Martin, they do around $16 billion in revenues each quarter. They did close to 50 billion for the full. They will do close to 50 billion for the full year. Their net earnings for the quarter are 1.7 billion. So they still have continuous cash coming in, which means they will be able to fund their operations and just keep expanding more and more into space exploration, and as well as their other businesses. See, they're pulling in close to $4 billion in cash every single year. That's pretty decent. On their balance sheet, you guys can see they have close to $21 billion in cash and cash equivalents. If you take into account all their other assets, such as plant and equipment, they have close to $50 billion in assets on their balance sheets. So these guys have tremendous cash flows coming in, but at the same time, they have ridiculous assets on their balance sheet already. So these guys are pretty insulated from any potential downfall or any catastrophe that might impact the markets in the next year or two. And even if there is a huge drop, these guys will have enough money to pretty much maintain their operations as usual. Okay, so one more really important stat I want to show you guys is the LMT backlog. Now, these guys have a pretty astounding backlog, which just means they cannot produce as many items as they have on order. So these guys are on 100% production, and they're still having huge problems keeping up with all their demand. So these guys are not demand constrained at all. This is a good thing, which means their business will most likely just keep growing and growing at a rapid pace. But one really important thing I want to focus on this backlog is they have about close to $30 billion in space-related items they need to deliver still. This is a huge deal because we can see from the previous quarter that backlog increased to about $3 billion. So these guys are getting continuous business to develop space products such as GPS for monitoring the weather, mapping of terrain like your Google Maps, and they're building a lot of GPS products for the military functions as well. But one of their main partners is actually NASA. Now NASA has contracted them to deliver 3 Orion spacecrafts for the use in a space mission. These are basically floating objects in space that look like a little space shuttle, but they're permanently in orbit, just circling the Earth. They're also a prime contractor for NASA to develop additional vehicles for Mars, such as the Space Rover, which is basically just picking up various minerals and elements on Mars, analyzing them, scanning them, and sending the feedback data back to Earth. So these guys have a pretty huge backlog just from NASA, but there's other countries that are just placing orders as well, such as India is ramping up their space program, China as well. And these guys will need tremendous amounts of parts and satellite parts, rocket parts, and they will pretty much be sourcing almost everything from Lockheed Martin. So these guys are contracted for the next decade with NASA to just keep delivering spacecraft for mission planning and support, using mathematical knowledge to pretty much map out space missions for NASA. These guys are heavily involved in pretty much every single launch that's not SpaceX. And as you can see, their business is pretty booming, and we will most likely continue on the same track. Now let's look at the second company that's space oriented. This company went public about 2 years ago. This is Rocket Lab United States, Rocket Lab USA. Their stock is down close to 65% since it went public. I believe this was a SPAC. So they had some pretty turbulent times, but this is a fairly new company. So you can expect some turbulence because these are not intensive generators of revenue that translates into cash. These are businesses that have to be developed over a course of a few years. So these guys are just starting out, and let's see. So far, they have accomplished 30 Electron launches, which is a smaller type of rocket, not as big as SpaceX, but smaller rockets that are delivering payloads into space. These guys deployed 150 satellites into orbit. That's pretty impressive for a fairly new startup. They have 3 launch pads. They have the second most frequently launched US rockets. So their small rockets are really just ramping up launches with every passing month, every passing year. And these guys are growing consistently. So let's see. They're building out a new rocket as well, a little bit bigger. Their parts are actually featured on over 1,700 satellites in orbit. So these guys are manufacturing parts for satellites, and these parts are ending up in various different satellites owned by different countries, owned by different companies. So these guys are ramping up pretty efficiently so far. Let's see, looking at their books, these guys have about $1 billion in cash. That's not a tremendous value. That's not a tremendous amount of money on their balance sheet, but it does seem enough to fund their operations for future projects and to maintain their current projects and obligations, to develop more satellite components, and basically just their manufacturing efforts in the space sector. See, these guys are doing $63 million in revenue for the most recent quarter. They're expected to do around probably a little bit over 200 million for the full year 2022. They'll most likely lose around 120 million on that revenue, but they will most likely be acquired. So my belief is once these guys are just a little bit more proven in their technology, somebody will absorb them, most likely Google or even Lockheed Martin, Boeing, or Northrop Grumman. So one of these guys will most likely make a bid for this company within a year. Just a few more things you have to consider. Space industry has currently around $400 billion addressable market. That includes rocket launches, satellite launches, GPS, satellite maintenance, space shuttle maintenance. So this is a huge market that's projected to grow over $1 trillion in 2030. So there's a huge demand for these products. We saw Lockheed Martin has a huge backlog. So that pretty much translates into these guys having a pretty huge backlog as well. So both companies are production constrained, and as time passes, they will most likely ramp up and just start bringing in massive revenues from this new frontier, the space, the final frontier. So I will most likely be adding these two shares to my portfolio in 2023. I will not be making one huge purchase. I will just be adding bit by bit until I'm comfortable with the size of the holding in my portfolio. So those are the two companies I will most likely be adding. If you guys are thinking about these companies or any other space-related businesses, please leave a comment below. And as always, like, subscribe, and share. Thanks, guys.